A millionaire froze in place when he recognized an elderly man, huddled against the wall of a building wrapped in a filthy blanket, his empty eyes staring into nothingness. His heart pounded as he realized that this man was no stranger. It was the only person who had believed in him when no one else did. Night was falling over Chicago, and the city pulsed with the glow of storefronts and the hurried hum of passing cars. Everett Langston walked down Michigan Avenue, adjusting his suit while checking his watch. He was late for an event at the Four Seasons, but something was nagging at him. He stopped at a red light and, out of habit, glanced across the street. That's when he saw him. A man sat on the sidewalk hunched against the wall of an old building. His beard was unkempt, his hair filthy, his eyes cast downward. He wore tattered clothes, barely shielded from the biting cold by a blanket far too thin for Chicago's harsh weather. Everett couldn't explain why, but something about that miserable figure made him shiver. A chill ran down his spine. Why did he feel like he knew this man? The light turned green, but Everett didn't move. The crowd continued on as usual, ignoring the man on the sidewalk. No one stopped. No one looked. Everett crossed the street. His heart was pounding. He approached, hesitant. The man remained motionless, rubbing his trembling hands together. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His weary eyes met Everett's. Time seemed to slow. For a moment, nothing else existed except those eyes. That expression, that hoarse, weakened voice that struck Everett like thunder. Everett. The sound of his own name made the ground vanish beneath his feet. His throat went dry. Professor Whitaker? For a brief second, the man's eyes lit up before fading again. Everett felt his stomach sink. It couldn't be. Harlan Whitaker, the teacher who had changed his life, the man who had stopped him from dropping out when everyone else had written him off, the only person who had believed in him when no one else had. And now he was here, broken, forgotten, wasting away on the streets of Chicago. The cold seemed even sharper. What happened to you? Everett's voice was unsteady. Harlan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Life happens, kid. Everett knelt down, ignoring the stares of passing pedestrians. Do you have somewhere to stay? The professor looked at the ground. Shelters win their space. But lately, he trailed off. He didn't need to finish. Everett understood the weight of those words. 5 years. 5 years without knowing that the one man who had truly made a difference in his life was living on the streets. Anger bubbled up inside him. How had a man this brilliant ended up here? You can't keep living like this, Everett said, his voice laced with frustration. Harlan lifted his eyes. And what do you plan to do? Buy me a new life? Everett took a deep breath. That's not it. I just want to help. The professor let out a weak laugh. I don't need your pity. But this wasn't pity. It was a debt. Everett clenched his fists. You weren't just a teacher. You were the teacher. You changed my life. And now? Harlan looked away. I'm not a teacher anymore, Everett. I'm nothing. Those words hit like a ton of bricks. Everett swallowed hard. That's not true. Silence. The noise of the city faded. All Everett could see was a man who refused to accept help because he believed he didn't deserve it. Let me do something for you, anything. Harlan sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. A cup of coffee. Just that. Everett nodded. Then let's get coffee. And without realizing it in that moment, he was about to change not just Harlan's life, but his own. The small cafe on 9th Street was nearly empty. The scent of roasted coffee beans and warm bread filled the air. Everett ordered 2 coffees and 2 sandwiches. Harlan accepted the drink but hesitated before touching the food. I can't pay you back. Who said you have to? The professor stayed silent. Then he picked up the sandwich and took a bite. Everett noticed how his hands trembled. What happened, Harlan? The professor stared into his coffee cup. After I retired, I wanted to open a reading center for young people. A friend convinced me to invest everything I had, said it would be something big. Everett already knew where this was going. And he disappeared with your money. Harlan let out a heavy sigh. And with my house. Everett closed his eyes for a second. My wife couldn't handle it. She left. And well, you can see the rest. Rage simmered inside Everett. You never asked for help? Harlan chuckled. Have you ever seen anyone eager to help a washed-up old man? Everett leaned in. I am. Harlan looked away. Why? Everett gave a small smile. Because years ago, a literature teacher believed that a troubled kid could be more than just a statistic. Harlan said nothing. Everett continued. Meet me here tomorrow. I want to show you something. Harlan hesitated, then nodded. The next morning, Everett was waiting at the same cafe. When Harlan arrived, Everett tossed a bag to him. What's this? New clothes. And a haircut wouldn't hurt. Harlan chuckled but took the bag. 2 hours later, he looked like a different man. The light drizzle trickled down the cafe windows, tracing uneven paths under the warm glow of the streetlights. The place was nearly empty. Everett Langston stirred his coffee, his gaze fixed on the man sitting across from him. Harlan Whitaker wore new clothes, his hair now clean and neatly cut, but his posture still carried the weight of a defeated man. Everett had hoped to see a different light in his eyes, a spark of hope, but all he found was exhaustion. So, this is it? Harlan's voice broke the silence. He stared out the window, his fingers tapping absently on the table. You give me some clothes, take me to a nice place, and think that fixes everything? Everett sighed, setting his cup down gently. No, but it's a start. Harlan let out a bitter laugh, a sound that didn't match the warmth of the cafe. Kid, you can dress me up like a man, but that doesn't change what I am. Everett leaned forward slightly. And what do you think you are, Harlan? Harlan pressed his lips together, staring at his hands. Someone the world forgot. The words hit Everett like a punch to the gut. For a moment he said nothing, letting them sink in. Then he pulled an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. Harlan eyed it with suspicion. What's this? An opportunity? Harlan hesitated before picking up the envelope and sliding the papers out. His eyes narrowed as he read, Whitaker Education Center? He looked up, confused. Yeah, a community school for adults who never got the chance to finish their education. They need a teacher. Harlan tossed the papers back into the envelope. This is ridiculous. Why? Because I'm not a teacher anymore. Harlan's voice rose thick with frustration. The cafe fell silent for a moment. Even the barista behind the counter paused what he was doing. Harlan rubbed his face, exhaling deeply. I'm not the man you knew, Everett. Everett didn't look away. I'm not asking you to be that man. I'm asking you to be who you are now. Harlan chuckled again, but this time there was no bitterness, just exhaustion. And who is that? Someone who can still change lives. Harlan shook his head. And what happens when they find out their teacher used to sleep on sidewalks? Everett rested his elbows on the table, lacing his fingers together. Maybe they need to know. Maybe they need to learn from someone who knows what it's like to fall. Harlan's eyes met his. For a second, Everett thought he saw something there. Something small. A flicker of hesitation, maybe doubt. But it wasn't a firm no. Come with me, just take a look. No commitment. Harlan glanced away. I can't promise anything. Everett smiled. Then we're making progress. The next morning, Everett took him to the Whitaker Education Center, a simple but well-maintained building in the heart of South Loop. Large windows let in plenty of natural light, and the classrooms were filled with shelves of worn books and neatly arranged desks. Harlan walked slowly through the hallway, as if stepping into unfamiliar territory. Everett watched his every movement, waiting for some kind of reaction, but Harlan kept his expression unreadable. Classes are held in the evenings. Most of the students work during the day. They passed by a classroom where a group of adults sat, listening intently to an instructor. A man in his 40s scribbled notes in a tattered notebook. A woman, probably in her 50s, frowned as she tried to solve a math problem. Everett saw Harlan stop in the doorway. He didn't step inside, but he didn't walk away either. The teacher in him was still there. The school's director, a short, energetic woman named Dorothy Mullins, approached with a warm smile. So you're Harlan Whitaker. Nice to finally meet you. Harlan shook her hand, hesitant. I hear you need teachers. I hear we have an excellent candidate. Harlan let out a short laugh. We'll see about that. Dorothy led him into another room while Everett watched from a distance. For all of Harlan's attempts to hide it, Everett could tell. He was curious. Some part of him still cared. Hours later, when they left the school, Harlan remained silent as they walked toward the car. Everett waited. You haven't said anything. Harlan sighed. It's a good place. And? He shoved his hands into his pockets. And I don't know if I'm the right person for this. Everett grinned. I think you do know. You just don't want to admit it. Harlan scoffed. Why are you so determined to make this happen, Everett? Everett stopped walking and looked him in the eye. Because when I was 17, a teacher made me believe I could be more than what the world told me I'd be. And now it's my turn to pay it forward. Harlan blinked a few times, then looked away. And what if I fail? You've already survived the worst, Harlan. What else do you have to lose? The professor stayed quiet for a long time. Then, for the first time since they'd reunited, he let out a different kind of sigh. Lighter. Give me some time to think. Everett nodded. Take all the time you need, but don't take too long. There are people waiting for you. They got into the car, and Everett started the engine. As he drove through the city, Harlan stared out the window. Everett didn't say anything, because he knew. Harlan Whitaker was fighting a battle with himself, but deep down, he had already made his decision. The past was still there, but maybe, just maybe, the future was waiting just ahead. The morning was cold and damp as Harlan Whitaker stood in front of the entrance to the Whitaker Education Center. His heart pounded as he stared at the glass doors. It felt strange to be here. He had clean clothes, a place to sleep, and hot coffee every morning. But inside, he still felt like the same broken man who had spent years being ignored on the streets. Could he really go back to teaching? Or worse, would anyone still believe in him? He took a deep breath and stepped forward. As soon as he entered, the scent of fresh coffee and old books filled the air. The hum of students chatting in the hallways was familiar, almost comforting. Dorothy Mullins, the school's director, appeared with a kind smile. I'm glad you came back, Harlan. He nodded, uncertain. I still don't know what I'm doing here. She smiled. Then I think you're about to find out. The literature teacher is out today. I need someone to fill in. Harlan froze. You want me to teach? Right now? You don't have to, but it would be a good test. He ran a hand down his face. I haven't taught in years, and yet I know no one can teach better than you. Harlan stayed quiet for a moment, and then, before he could think too much about it, Dorothy opened the classroom door. All eyes turned to him. Silence fell over the room. The students weren't kids, they were adults, each with a different story. A middle-aged man hunched over a notebook, a woman clutching her child's backpack in her lap, a young woman with tired eyes. They were here because they wanted to be here. Harlan took a deep breath and stepped inside. He walked to the chalkboard and picked up a piece of chalk. He felt the familiar weight of the white dust between his fingers. And then, as if that small gesture had awakened something inside him, he spoke. My name is Harlan Whitaker, and it looks like you're stuck with me today. A quiet chuckle rippled through the room. He felt a little more at ease. Before we start, I want to know something. What brought you here? Why did you decide to come back to school? For a moment, no one answered. Then a gray-haired man raised his hand. I lost my job in construction. Without a diploma, no one will hire me. I want to change that. A young woman no older than 25 murmured, My family could never afford my education. Now I want to do this for myself. The woman holding the child's backpack sighed. I want my son to be proud of me. I want to show him it's never too late to learn. Harlan studied their faces, and in that moment, something happened. A spark. That fire he thought had burned out. He looked at the students, felt the weight of their stories, and knew he still had something to give the world. He smiled. Then let's get started. The lesson went by faster than he expected. Harlan realized that despite being away from the classroom for so long, he still knew how to teach. He still knew how to hold attention, how to explain a complex idea in a simple way. Before he knew it, he was immersed in the discussion, asking questions, encouraging the students to think. And then, the bell rang. The students began packing up their things. A woman who had been silent throughout the entire lesson approached him. Professor, she hesitated. Are you coming back tomorrow? Harlan felt a tightness in his chest. He opened his mouth to answer but paused. He still didn't know. Dorothy, who had been watching from the doorway, smiled. That depends on him. The woman nodded and left. Harlan turned to Dorothy. That was a dirty trick. She crossed her arms, laughing. I didn't do anything but give you a chance. He sighed. I still don't know if I'm ready for this. No one ever is, Harlan. But sometimes, we just have to take a step. He glanced at the chalkboard. The faint marks of his writing were still there, proof that he could still teach. Dorothy smiled. If you want to come back tomorrow, the door will be open. Harlan didn't respond, but something inside him already knew the answer. That night, he returned to the small hotel room where Everett had temporarily put him up. He sat on the edge of the bed, took off his shoes, and stared at the floor. His chest was full of conflicting emotions. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something dangerous. Hope. He ran his hands over his face. He thought of the students, of their attentive eyes, of the way they absorbed every word. He had believed he was dead inside. But today, in that classroom, he felt alive again. The sun was already high when Harlan Whitaker arrived at the Whitaker Education Center the next morning. The crisp Chicago breeze cut against his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was focused on a single thought. Am I really going to do this? He stopped on the sidewalk, staring at the entrance of the building. Something inside him still resisted. The night before, after returning to the hotel, he hadn't been able to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of his students. He saw the light in their eyes when they grasped a new concept. He saw the young woman with dark circles under her eyes, furiously scribbling notes. He saw the gray-haired man furrowing his brow as he struggled through an exercise. And most of all, he saw the woman who had asked if he'd be coming back. The truth was, he wanted to come back, but part of him still couldn't accept it. Did he even deserve this second chance? He sighed, running a hand through his short hair as he looked at the door. Then he heard a voice behind him. If you stand there too long, people will think you're a government inspector. Harlan turned to see Dorothy Mullins, the school director, smiling as she held out a cup of coffee. He let out a short laugh. Maybe I'm just trying to decide whether to go in or not. Dorothy extended the coffee toward him. I took the liberty. A man doesn't make good decisions on an empty mind. Harlan accepted the cup, feeling the warmth of the liquid spread through his fingers. Dorothy, you don't need to say anything. She smiled, tilting her head slightly. You just need to walk through that door. The rest will figure itself out. Harlan looked at the entrance one more time, and then he took the first step. The classroom was quiet when he walked in. The students were already there, scattered across their seats, flipping through notebooks or simply waiting for class to start. The woman who had asked if he'd return lifted her eyes and gave him a small smile. Harlan felt something tighten in his chest. He set his books down on the desk, took a deep breath, and turned to the class. Looks like you couldn't get rid of me after all. A soft chuckle rippled through the room. He allowed himself a small smile. Picking up a piece of chalk, he wrote on the board, Everyone has a story. Then, he turned to the students. Yesterday, I heard a little about why you're here. But now, I want to know more. I want to hear your stories. Silence settled over the room. The students exchanged hesitant glances. Then, the gray-haired construction worker Glenn cleared his throat. I've been in construction since I was 16. Never needed a diploma. Until I did. He looked down at his calloused hands. Being strong used to be enough. But now they want you to have a piece of paper saying you know how to do your job. Harlan nodded. And how does it feel to be here? Glenn hesitated. Feels like I'm an old man trying to catch up on lost time. The young woman with dark circles, Caitlin, shook her head. You're not alone in that. I think we all feel like we're racing against the clock. She looked down at her desk, fidgeting with the corner of her notebook. My parents had me young. My mom never finished school and my dad left when I was little. I started working early and, well, now I'm here. The room stayed quiet. Then the woman clutching her son's backpack, Marlene, sighed. My son is 8. He's in 3rd grade, and I realize that sometimes he understands his schoolwork better than I do. That scared me. I don't want him to be ashamed of his mother. For a moment, the room sat in silence. Harlan looked at each of them. Every story carried weight. Every story held years of struggle, of sacrifice, of invisible battles. He took a deep breath. I want you all to know that you're not behind. Everyone moves at their own pace. It doesn't matter where you've been, What matters is where you want to go. The students watched him in silence. Then slowly, one by one, they nodded. Harlan felt something shift inside him. This time, there was no doubt. He belonged here. At the end of class, as students were gathering their things, Caitlin approached his desk. She clutched a notebook tightly against her chest. "Professor." Harlan looked up. "Yes?" She bit her lip, hesitating. "Do you think some people just aren't meant to learn?" Harlan frowned. "Why do you ask?" Caitlin glanced at her notebook. "I was always bad at school. Teachers said I didn't try hard enough, but I did try. I just couldn't learn like everyone else." Harlan studied the way she held the notebook, like she was afraid to show what was inside. He stood up and gently took it from her hands. Flipping it open, he found pages upon pages of messy notes, scribbles, and repeated phrases. He understood immediately. Caitlin wasn't stupid. She had just never been taught in a way that worked for her. Harlan closed the notebook and met her eyes. "Let me show you a different way to learn." Caitlin's eyes flickered with something between hope and fear. She nodded slowly. "I'd like that." That night, Harlan returned to the hotel, sat on the bed, and stared at his hands. They were still trembling slightly. But this time, it wasn't from cold or hunger. It was because, for the first time in years, he felt purpose. He was helping someone again. That morning, when Harlan Whitaker walked into the Whitaker Education Center, something was different. He didn't stop at the door. He didn't hesitate before stepping inside. This time, he knew he belonged here. It was a strange feeling, one he had almost forgotten. Just weeks ago, he was still sleeping on the streets, invisible to the world. Now, people were calling him Professor. He was needed again. But with that came responsibility. He couldn't let these people down. Caitlin was already in the classroom when he arrived. She looked more anxious than usual, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest. When she saw Harlan, her grip on the book tightened. He recognized that look. It was fear, not the fear of failure, something deeper. The fear of proving that all the terrible things she'd been told about herself were true. The fear of discovering she really wasn't good enough. Harlan walked over to her desk and pulled up a chair. "Did you bring your notebook?" Caitlin hesitated, then slowly pushed it toward him. Harlan opened it, scanning the pages. As he had noticed the day before, effort wasn't the problem. Caitlin tried, but she was lost in the words, as if no one had ever taught her a method that actually worked for her. He grabbed a blank sheet of paper and drew 2 columns. On one side, he wrote, "My way." On the other, "The way I was taught." Then he looked at her. "Now tell me, how do you learn best?" She frowned. "I don't know. Everyone always told me I just didn't pay enough attention." "That's not an answer." She bit her lip. "I think I learn best by seeing things. But in school, they always made me write long summaries." Harlan nodded and sketched a simple diagram, connecting key words with arrows. "What if you tried this instead?" Caitlin stared at the diagram like she was seeing something for the first time. Hesitant, she picked up her pencil and started organizing her thoughts in a way that made sense to her. For the first time, the fear in her eyes gave way to something else. Curiosity. "I've never learned like this before." Harlan smiled. "That's why it never worked." Caitlin kept scribbling. The frustration that had weighed on her face before was lifting, little by little. Harlan felt a knot tighten in his chest. How many years had this girl believed she was stupid? How long had she carried that burden, when the failure had never been hers, but the system's? That night, after class, Harlan stepped out of the building and found Everett Langston leaning against his car, waiting for him. The millionaire was dressed in an immaculate overcoat, but his expression was relaxed. "So, looks like you finally accepted your place." Harlan scoffed. "I still don't know if this is permanent." Everett crossed his arms, smirking. "Sure, and I bet tomorrow you'll say you're still thinking about it." Harlan chuckled. He wouldn't admit it, but Everett was right. This had already become a part of him. "How did you know?" Harlan asked. "Know what?" "That this was what I needed." Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. "Because I was one of those students once." Harlan blinked, surprised. Everett never talked about his past. "What do you mean?" The millionaire glanced at the street as if reliving something distant. "I was a lost cause, Harlan. No one believed in me. Only one teacher saw something different. Only one person told me I could be more. He turned back to face him. And that person was you. Harlan was speechless. He had never realized how much he had truly impacted Everett's life. And now, after everything, it was Everett who was helping him find his way back. Life was ironic. Harlan sighed, rubbing his tired face. This all still feels strange to me, Everett, like part of me is still stuck in the past. Everett smiled. Then maybe it's time for you to understand something. Harlan raised an eyebrow. Everett opened the car door and motioned for him to get in. Come with me. I want to show you something. Harlan hesitated, but something in Everett's expression told him this was important. He got in. Where are we going? Everett started the engine. Somewhere that'll prove to you that you're not that broken man anymore. Harlan frowned, confused. But deep down, he knew he was about to take another step, a step that could change everything. The car glided smoothly through the streets of Chicago, the engine humming softly in the quiet of the night. Harlan Whitaker stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker like they belonged to a world he no longer felt part of. At the wheel, Everett Langston remained calm, driving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Harlan crossed his arms, suspicious. So, are you going to tell me where we're headed? Or is this part of your plan to keep me curious? Everett smirked. You always hated surprises, but I think this one will be different. The car turned off the main roads and entered a quieter part of the city. The wide, silent streets were a stark contrast to the chaos of downtown. The houses here were modest but well kept. No extravagance, just a sense of quiet stability. When Everett pulled up in front of a small brick building, Harlan's brows furrowed. He knew this place. A simple sign read, Westwood Community Shelter. His throat went dry. Everett shut off the engine and turned to him. Shall we? Harlan sat still for a moment. He knew what was inside that building. He knew because, at his lowest, this place had been his last option before he stopped trying altogether. He had spent nights here, curled up on a thin mattress surrounded by other men and women crushed by time and misfortune. He remembered the smell of cheap soup, the donated clothes that rarely fit, the feeling of being just another forgotten face. And now Everett had brought him back. Harlan closed his eyes for a second before letting out a long sigh. Why here? Everett gripped the steering wheel. Because you need to see it with your own eyes. Harlan didn't ask anything else. He just opened the door and stepped out. Inside the shelter, the familiar scent of weak coffee and freshly baked bread hit him immediately. There were murmured conversations, the quiet clinking of spoons against bowls. He saw men hunched over their plates, eating slowly, as if uncertain when their next meal would come. Women leaning against each other, sharing small stories of their day. Children playing in a corner, clutching the only dolls they owned. He recognized those eyes, the same hollow gaze he had carried for years. And then something deep inside him twisted. He wasn't one of them anymore, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore them. Everett placed a hand on his shoulder. Do you see it? Harlan swallowed hard. I see it. No, Harlan. What do you really see? Harlan studied the room again, the weight of it pressing down on him. And then, he understood. He didn't just see pain, he saw possibility. Because if he had made it out, maybe others could too. Everett nodded toward a group of volunteers in the corner, speaking with a woman. She turned at their approach and Harlan felt a jolt in his chest. Margaret Holt, the social worker who years ago had tried to help him when he wasn't ready to be helped. Her eyes widened. Harlan? He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come right away. Then, Margaret smiled, placing a gentle hand on his arm. It's good to see you. I always wondered what happened to that stubborn man. Harlan let out a dry chuckle. I guess he finally listened to some good advice. She studied him for a moment, her gaze taking in the new version of the man she had once known. I heard about what you're doing. Everett told me. You're teaching again. Harlan nodded slowly. I'm trying. Margaret crossed her arms. That means you've seen both sides now. Harlan lowered his gaze. I suppose I have. She took a step closer. Then tell me, if you had gotten the right help back then, would you have accepted it? The question hung between them. Harlan took a deep breath. I think I needed to believe there was still something in me worth saving. Margaret nodded. That's exactly what these people need right now. She gestured around the shelter. And maybe you're the one who can show them. Harlan's stomach tightened. Not because he rejected the idea, but because for the first time, he considered it possible. Everett grinned beside him. That's why I brought you here. You've already saved more lives than you realize, Harlan. But I think there's still one left. Harlan met his gaze. Everett tilted his head slightly. Yours. The silence was heavy. And then, as if something finally cracked inside him, Harlan let out a slow breath, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The truth was simple. He had been afraid to move forward, afraid to let himself be someone again. But now, standing in front of these people, in a place that had once represented his worst days, he understood. His past would not define him anymore. He turned to Margaret. If I wanted to help, where would I start? She smiled. I think you already have. That night, when Harlan returned to the hotel, he sat on the edge of the bed and ran his hands over his face. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a burden to the world. He felt like he belonged to it. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time, he felt alive. The next morning, Harlan Whitaker arrived at the Whitaker Education Center feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Purpose. He walked through the hallways with steady steps, listening to the quiet hum of conversations, the scrape of chairs being pulled out, the rustling of notebook pages. The school was alive, and somehow, so was he. But this time, he knew his mission didn't end here. The previous night at the shelter had forced him to see something he'd been trying to ignore. If he had made it out, others could too. And now, he wanted to be part of that. His first class of the day began like any other. He wrote on the board, "What keeps us from moving forward?" The students exchanged glances. Marlene, the mother who wanted to be a role model for her son, frowned. Fear. Glenn, the gray-haired construction worker, nodded. Or shame. Caitlin drummed her fingers on the desk. Or the feeling that we've already lost so much time that trying doesn't even seem worth it anymore. Harlan crossed his arms, studying them. He knew exactly what that felt like. And what if I told you none of those things have to be a life sentence? Glenn let out a low chuckle. Sounds easier said than done, Professor. I know. Harlan took a deep breath. I know because I had to believe it myself. He turned to Caitlin. Yesterday you asked me if some people just aren't meant to learn. Do you still believe that? Caitlin averted her gaze, biting her lip. Harlan continued. The problem was never you. The problem was that no one ever taught you the right way. But now you have a chance. All of you do. The room fell into silence. Then, slowly, Marlene nodded. I think the first step is believing we still have a chance. Harlan smiled. Exactly. At the end of class, Caitlin waited until everyone had left before approaching his desk. She hesitated, clutching her notebook to her chest. Professor, can I ask you something? Of course. She took a deep breath. Why do you care so much? I mean, why don't you just do your job and leave it at that? Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down in front of her. Because I've been where you are. Caitlin's eyes widened. What? I've hit rock bottom. I've believed my life couldn't be fixed. I've sat in a classroom like this thinking that nothing a teacher said could change my reality. Caitlin stayed silent, taking in his words. What changed? Harlan gave a small smile. Someone believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. She looked away for a second. I don't think I've ever had that. Harlan met her gaze. Now you do. For a moment, Caitlin looked like she might cry, but she quickly covered it up, shaking her head with a small laugh. You're different from any teacher I've ever had. Harlan chuckled. Well, I have a bit of an unconventional resume. She smiled but didn't say anything else. She simply closed her notebook and left the room, leaving behind a silence filled with meaning. That night, Harlan returned to Westwood Community Shelter. But this time, he wasn't there as someone who needed help. He was there to offer it. Margaret greeted him with a knowing smile. Back so soon? Harlan smirked. I guess I don't know how to do things slowly. She crossed her arms. What do you want to do? Harlan glanced around, taking in the tired faces, the dirty hands, the eyes that always seemed to be looking down. He knew exactly how they felt. So he took a deep breath and answered, "I want to teach them." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Teach them what?" Harlan smiled. "That they still have a chance." The first lesson happened 2 days later. It wasn't in a classroom with neatly arranged chairs. There was no chalkboard or crisp textbooks. Harlan simply sat in the shelter's back courtyard, where a few people were gathered. He took a piece of paper and scribbled a single word in the middle: restart. Some people glanced at him with curiosity. Others ignored him completely, skeptical. He held up the paper. "What does this word mean to you?" Silence. Then, a thin man with hollow eyes muttered, "Nonsense. Some people don't get to start over." Harlan nodded slowly. "I understand why you think that. But what if I told you that I've been exactly where you are?" The man scoffed. "Bullshit. You don't look like one of us." Harlan exhaled. "Because one day, someone helped me remember that I could be more." The man didn't say anything. Others began watching him more closely. And then, for the first time, Harlan felt the impact he could have here. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a place full of unfinished stories. And if he could help even one person realize that their story wasn't over yet, then it would all be worth it. In Everett's luxurious office, a group of investors sat around the conference table. Everett scanned the room, taking his time. Then, he said, "What we're about to do is going to change lives." The businessmen exchanged curious glances. Everett picked up a document from the table and slid it to the center. "I'm launching the largest rehabilitation and education program for the homeless this city has ever seen. And I need all of you to make it happen." Someone cleared their throat. "Everett, don't you think this is risky? We're talking about people with no work history, some with serious issues. Couldn't this be a waste of investment?" Everett crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "You're looking at a waste of investment." The room went silent. "See this man?" He placed a photo of Harlan on the table. Years ago, he was sleeping on the streets. He had nothing. Today, he's changed the lives of dozens of people. He looked at the investors once more. And tomorrow, with our support, he could change thousands. A few seconds of silence passed. Then, the first investor picked up a pen and signed the contract. One by one, the others followed. Everett smiled. The initiative was officially launched. The big day arrived. Everyone was gathered in the auditorium of the Whitaker Education Center. It was graduation day and Harlan stood on stage, watching his students. In the middle of the audience, Caitlin held an envelope in her trembling hands. When she opened it, her eyes filled with tears. Harlan noticed her hesitation and walked over to where she was sitting. "What does it say?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, her voice shaking. "It says I passed." Harlan's chest tightened. She had done it. The girl who had spent her whole life believing she wasn't good enough had just proven everyone wrong. Caitlin threw her arms around him, and he hugged her back, feeling the weight of years of pain finally being left behind. When she walked up to the stage to receive her diploma, the audience erupted into applause. Among them, Everett Langston watched Harlan with quiet pride. "I knew you'd make a difference." Harlan took a deep breath, feeling something new inside him. Peace. A few months later, Harlan faced a new audience, this time at a charity event to raise funds for expanding the education program at the shelter. He stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. The crowd waited eagerly to hear his story. He took a deep breath and began. "A few years ago, I lost everything." The room fell silent. And when I say everything, I'm not just talking about money or material things. I lost my identity, my purpose, my will to keep going. He paused, scanning the faces before him. But someone believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And because of that, I learned to believe in others. Everett's eyes gleamed. Margaret smiled softly. Caitlin discreetly wiped away tears. Harlan continued. So many people are just waiting for a chance, a gesture, a word of encouragement, a teacher who sees something in them that no one else does. He turned to Caitlin. I've learned that no one is a lost cause. The audience rose in a powerful standing ovation. Harlan smiled. Then he turned to Everett, who watched him with a calm expression. But none of this would have been possible if someone hadn't reached out first. Everett shook his head, smiling. I only gave back what a teacher once gave me. And now, let me ask you, if you could change someone's life with a simple gesture, who would it be and what would you do? If you enjoyed this story, comment gratitude so I'll know you stayed until the end and felt moved by this journey.